Hey everybody, welcome to Module 3. I just want to take a few minutes and go over some of the key components for this week's assignments. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the Milestone 1 guidelines and rubrics, so I make sure you guys all do well on that one. But just quickly, let me take a look at my notes here regarding this week's discussion board. And basically, you're just going to be talking about courts of special jurisdiction. So basically, we're talking about bankruptcy court, immigration court, traffic court, family court, drug court, stuff like that. And basically, you're to select one of those courts that you think you are likely to engage in at some point in time in your professional life. So depending on what your career choice might be, which one of these courts might you find yourself in one day? And then you're supposed to answer a series of questions related to that. Key here is remember that in your response to your peers this week, ask questions about the courts that they have selected and explain whether you believe you are likely or unlikely to ever engage with those courts and why. So you have to choose somebody that selected a different court than you did and then answer that additional prompt. So make sure you carefully look at all the prompts on the discussion board so you make sure that you do a good job, okay? It's a pretty straightforward assignment, but it gives you a chance to look at some of these other type of specialty courts, and then by selecting a classmate who selected a different one, you'll educate yourself just a little bit more in terms of what those courts do, okay? So let's move right over into our Milestone 1 guidelines and rubrics. So in Module 3, you're doing our Milestone 1 assignment. And for those of you familiar with how we do things here at Southern New Hampshire is we do a series of milestones, and then our final project is really all those milestones put together. So hopefully what will happen is each time you do these assignments and I provide feedback, your assignment will be maybe fine-tuned and tweaked if needed, polished, and you can just copy paste and get it ready for your final project, because really that's what our final project is. It's a series of the milestones, and obviously the goal is for you to do as best as possible in the final project, and hopefully that will take place. Let me adjust things here. Hopefully that'll take place. There we go. Hopefully that'll take place as you you polish and clean up your previous milestones. Okay, so this scenario is going to run us through the course of all of our milestones, and it's going to be talking about obviously state, federal, local jurisdiction systems and how cases move through each of those systems, or your familiarity with both federal and state systems. So you can basically read through this introduction part right here, but your final project, you will examine and evaluate the roles and processes of the system regardless of your position within the systems. Through analyzing a scenario, you will determine proper venue, jurisdiction, and litigation process, as well as make administrative decisions. You will also assume multiple perspectives in order to determine efficient and effective ways to move a case through the judicial process. In this first milestone for your final project, you'll begin to examine the scenario provided below and explore relevant judicial systems as they apply to the scenario. Specifically, you will submit the draft of the judicial system section of your scenario analysis. Using your assigned reading and course materials, you will analyze the structure of the courts and the application of principles of jurisdiction and venue to the scenario you provide below. This is the same scenario you will use to inform you in your next milestone assignment and your final project submission. So here's a scenario. Jed, Herman, and Jane live in Washington, D.C. Jed and Jane entered the local bank and took $65,000. Jed and Herman both used shotguns during the robbery, though no one was hurt. Jane drove the getaway vehicle. 2 hours later, they headed toward the Canadian border, and they were stopped by the police for speeding and taken into custody. The police determined that Jed and Jane matched the eyewitnesses' description of the robbers. Jane confessed to bank robbery scheme. Jed and Herman denied their involvement. The police only recovered $25,000 in cash, but were unable to determine if the recovered money was taken from the bank. The police determined that Jed was a convicted felon at the time of the armed bank robbery. The local police and FBI were involved in the investigation. Now, the defense attorneys for each defendant, Jed, Herman, and Jade, request a continuance for 4 months to sift through the evidence. The prosecution objects and argues that the delay would significantly clog the court's already heavy workload. In the alternative, the prosecution argues that if the court grants a continuance, then the prosecution would be allowed to prolong turning over remaining discovery. The defense attorneys object and argue that this hinders their effective representation of their clients and would hinder their prompt resolution. The defense attorneys further argue that their clients deserve a well-prepared and thorough defense. The judge currently has trials blocked for the next 10 months and wants to try this case now. So the judge has to make a decision here, and we'll talk about that here in just a little bit, in determining whether or not he or she is going to grant an extension to the lawyers. Remember, the judge's job is to make sure that a defendant's receive a fair trial and make sure that their lawyers do a very competent job so that they don't have these type of legal issues come back later as an appeal. So you need to figure out whether you think this 4-month extension is reasonable or not reasonable, and whether you think that, for example, the district attorney or the prosecuting attorney saying that he's not going to give them other discovery right away, and how's that going to impact the overall effectiveness and efficiency of trying to get this case to the court system. Okay, and so those are real life things that judges have to contend with, and those are called continuances. And you go to some cases and it's continued again and again and again. You tend to find those on maybe serious cases such as homicides or cases involving multiple victims or an array of things that could tend to drag a case out for whatever reason. Sometimes it's a strategy by the defense, and sometimes it could be a strategy for the people. But judges ultimately have to decide when a case is going to go to trial and set a date, and both sides need to be ready to go. So we'll probably revisit that here, but let me move on just so I can go over these critical elements real quick, because I want you to make sure that you address each of the critical elements associated with this assignment. And again, this assignment's basically going to get us used to the court structure, the systems, venue, jurisdiction, those kind of basic key concepts, and then we're going to build upon that as we move along. So one of the critical elements is you're to describe the hierarchical structure for federal, state, and local court systems. What are the primary role of each level? So again, we're going back to that basic tiered system within the federal, state, and local courts. And again, we talk about the tier, we talk about the trial courts, we talk about the appellate courts, and we talk about the Supreme Courts. Every state has a Supreme Court. Every state has an appellate court. We found that out. And at the local level, those courts may be broken up into different types of courts. You may have a traffic court, you may have a family law court, but nonetheless, we have those trial courts. We call them all trial courts. And what's the primary role of each level? So you talked about those. And we've done that in some of our other assignments. Go back and look at those notes. Fine-tune your response to this, but understand the hierarchical structure of the federal, state, local court system and what each role is at that particular level. Okay, so again, that's just sort of a review of some of the things we've already talked about. Explain the primary differences between federal and state levels of judicial systems. Well, as I told you in one of my previous announcements, federal courts deal with federal statutes. Bank robbery is a federal statute. Terrorism is a federal statute. State courts deal with state statutes. So if you live in Los Angeles, California, and you commit a burglary, the state of California has a statute for burglary. Okay, you're not going to go to federal court because you commit a state crime. Ain't going to happen. Why? Because federal court does not have jurisdiction. State court does. So we have state courts and federal courts. So again, federal statutes, state statutes, that's going to tell you where you're going to go in terms of which judicial system. Remember, in our little scenario here, bank robbery is a federal crime as well as a state crime, but for our purposes, we're going to make it a federal offense. We're going to prosecute them at the federal level, okay? Describe the importance of having these different levels. Well, it does add a sense of efficiency and effectiveness to the criminal justice system. By appellate rulings and decisions, those appellate courts sort of let the courts underneath know the expectations and interpretation of the law, so we have some uniformity. And at the higher level, on Supreme Court levels, again, it's designed to address issues of law that might be confusing throughout the appellate districts or throughout a state. Okay, so those are going to be very important in terms of how you understand that. So the importance again of these is obviously different crimes belong in different jurisdictions, but there's also the idea that these offer a more effective and efficient judicial system in the country. Okay. Next, you are to explain subject matter jurisdiction for federal, state, and local courts. What impact does that have on the efficiency of court systems? So the subject matter jurisdiction goes back to our discussion board question. All right, so what is a subject matter jurisdiction? And you can define it. Bankruptcy for federal courts, state courts. And a lot of times state courts and local courts are sort of the same thing, although in some states you might have city courts, so that's going to be local and it's not going to be state. So depending on where you live, a state court may be all you have to contend with. If you live in a state like New York that has state and local courts, then you're going to have to understand what takes place at each of these different levels. All right, so subject matter jurisdiction, we already talked about it. Federal level, bankruptcy. State level could be probate, it could be juvenile. Local level could be traffic violations, housing code violations, things like that. And how does this impact have on the efficiency of the court system? Well, it makes it operate a little bit more efficiently, because some of these problems at the local level and state level, let's say housing courts dealing with issues in housing projects or dealing with development issues or an array of things, can have a significant impact on the business community. But outside of that, it does offer a more efficient and effective system. So you can get some more information from the textbook, but just know that this is basically a spin-off from our discussion board. Distinguish which courts would have jurisdiction in this scenario to defend your response. So you could argue state court theoretically, but in this case it happened in Washington, D.C. So the uniqueness about Washington, D.C. is Washington, D.C. is not a state. It is the District of Columbia. So it is under federal jurisdiction. So that solves that problem for us right there, right? So this is a federal matter. So what you would say here is that the jurisdiction of this court, District of Columbia, is going to be in the federal court system because it is the District of Columbia. If this were in a state like Kansas, for example, then we might have, either one could possibly have jurisdiction. And then you're to defend your answer. So what you need to do here is do some homework. Go take a look at that map structure from Module 2 and look up Washington, D.C., and you'll have an idea as to how the court system is structured in Washington, D.C. Next is determine how venue is decided upon and what are the implications of venue. So it goes back to the discussion or lecture on venue. What is venue? Venue is location. And typically venue is going to be, for criminal matters, typically is going to be the venue in which the crime started or the crime occurred or something along that line which connects that particular venue to the criminal offense, okay? So when you determine venue. So in this particular case, we do have a couple of different situations. We do have a situation where they rob a bank in Washington, D.C., and then they're stopped. We really don't know where they're stopped, but they're stopped and arrested by another law enforcement agency. So the question of venue may arise. But the venue is going to go back to the more serious crime. In this case, it's going to be bank robbery, even though one of the defendants, as you remember, had a gun and was previously convicted and couldn't have a gun. Okay. What would the venue be for this scenario? Defend your answer why this venue is the most appropriate. Again, Washington, D.C., federal venue. Do some research and identify the court for me if you can. Start doing that because that's going to be critical as you continue this project, okay? So there's proficient, needed improvement, not evident. If you notice this time exemplary is gone, so do a good job, cover the basic material well, and you'll do just fine with this assignment. As we move to the final paper, you'll see there will be an exemplary category, so you may have to take a look at that. So when you give me your final project, it's very polished and well taken care of, all right? If you have any questions with this assignment during the week, don't hesitate to call or text me, or send me an email. All right, I hope that's useful.